In this video, we're going to be breaking down what pneumonia actually is and some possible ways of acquiring pneumonia. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually draw out a diagram of the lungs just to make this really clear and easy to understand. Now, this small red structure that I'm drawing in the center, I'm going to explain what that actually is in more detail later in the video. So we have our trachea here, you can see leading off, and the actual lungs, which I'm drawing right here. And this is quite a rough drawing, but this should give you a good idea of what the structures actually look like. Okay, now once inside of the lungs themselves, so the trachea is outside the lungs and leads into the lungs, and that's when the divisions into bronchioles and then conducting bronchioles and respiratory bronchioles occurs. And at the base of these respiratory bronchioles are these small bubbles. You can see here, these small sacs, and these are known as alveoli. So as you can see here, and I'm going to draw this on this side as well. So that branching differs conducting bronchioles and then respiratory bronchioles, and finally those alveoli at the base. Okay, great. So I'm going to actually draw a zoomed in structure of these alveoli at the top left corner of the board because pneumonia specifically impacts these alveoli. So let's draw this right here so you can see these bubbles in greater detail. Yeah. Now, around these alveoli, there is going to be this lung tissue, which is right here. And there will be a blood vessel, which will be a capillary. So how these alveoli actually work is that they are the final point at which oxygen, which is inhaled, can be diffused through into the capillaries, allowing for the reoxygenation of blood. And the carbon dioxide waste products from the deoxygenated blood and that will enter the capillary will exchange back into the alveoli and will become recirculated back out of the body. So this relationship between the alveoli and the blood vessel facilitates oxygen entering the blood and carbon dioxide leaving the blood and being recirculated. Now, the problem is that say when a bacteria or virus enters into this alveolar sac, what actually will happen is that this alveolar tissue, so say this region around the sides, they will actually become inflamed, and as a result, the body will mount an inflammatory response. So this is when macrophages and neutrophils will enter into this region, and this capillary region as well will become quite leaky, and a fluid known as exudate will actually enter into this alveolar sac. So the combination of exudate and inflammatory cells will cause a blockage, and I'm going to draw that right here. So you can see all this fluid at the base of this alveolar region. Now don't worry about orientation that much in terms of base. It's more just about understanding that this exudate inflammatory cells will cause a blockage, preventing the effective diffusion of this oxygen into the bloodstream. Now, the key issue with this exudate inflammatory cells blocking off the oxygen is that the first thing is that oxygen cannot diffuse. Well, it can diffuse, but it cannot diffuse effectively. Into bloodstream. CO2 cannot be recirculated effectively. There is a specific term known as the VQ ratio. V stands for ventilation, which is the amount of air that is able to enter into the alveoli, and Q represents the perfusion rate, which is the amount of blood that is available to uptake oxygen. Pneumonia will actually result in a very low VQ ratio because the amount of air that is available for the blood to uptake will be quite low. So for example, the V value will be quite low because there's going to be less oxygen available to be taken up by the blood. However, the perfusion rate, the Q value, the blood will there'll still be a high volume of blood available to receive that oxygen. And as a result of a low VQ ratio, so I'm going to write low VQ ratio, if that's visible there, this will actually cause hypoxia, because there is a low amount of oxygen in the blood. And in really severe cases, this can actually cause something known as interpulmonary shunt, where the blood which passes through the capillaries actually does not become reoxygenated. Okay, so that's just a few things about what pneumonia actually is. It starts off with this alveolar tissue becoming inflamed, and an inflammatory response responding to that inflammation, where inflammatory cells are released into that region, and the actual capillaries become leaky and release a fluid known as exudate, which causes that blockage region. This blockage prevents the diffusion of oxygen effectively into the bloodstream, and CO2 cannot be recirculated effectively. This represents a low VQ ratio, which is a low ventilator to perfusion rate, which refers to a low oxygen availability for a normal volume of blood, which ultimately results in a low volume of oxygen entering into the blood, which causes hypoxia, and severe cases causes that interpulmonary shunt, where the blood passes through the capillaries but is not effectively reoxygenated. The next thing I want to talk about is how can pneumonia actually be acquired? So there's a few different ways. So I'm going to write at the top here how pneumonia can actually be acquired. Okay, so the first way is known as community acquisition. And community acquisition, there's two types. There's bacterial community acquisition and viral community acquisition. Bacterial community acquisition of pneumonia is known as Streptococcus pneumonia, which is where the bacteria Streptococcus will enter this alveolar region and cause pneumonia. And the viral type of community acquisition is the flu virus. So Streptococcus pneumonia and the flu virus. And this represents community acquisition. Okay, the second type of method of acquiring pneumonia is known as ventilator-acquired pneumonia. And this specifically refers to when a ventilator, which bypasses traditional immunity responses in the body, like the first and second line of defense, and immediately enters the airways. And if this ventilator tube, say, has some bacteria on it or has not been able to be cleaned properly, this will immediately trigger the inflammatory response and cause pneumonia. And the third type is known as aspiration-acquired pneumonia. Now, the structure that I drew at the beginning, this small structure here, is actually the epiglottis. And I'm going to draw a label to that because it's quite important. Now, the epiglottis represents a lid. It divides the entry of food into the food pathway and divides the entry of air into the air pathways. During, say, the loss of consciousness, or when an individual has consumed an excess amount of alcohol, if vomit is exiting the body and being released from the body, this epiglottis may actually, by a slight malfunction, actually allow for this vomit to enter into this airway pathway, and this could cause the alveoli to be exposed to viruses or bacteria, and as a result trigger pneumonia. Essentially, the aspiration just refers to this epiglottis allowing a specific bacteria or virus to enter this airway process. Okay, before we conclude this video, there's a couple things that I want to mention involving symptoms of pneumonia. The first one is coughing, and coughing is essentially when the airways are irritated, forcing that forced expulsion of air. The second symptom is a fever, which is a marker that the immunity system is being activated. And this involves cytokines and various other immunity cells working together to facilitate this immune response. And finally, there is actually a small term that I want to mention known as dyspnea, that I didn't mention. It's also associated with hypoxia. And dyspnea essentially refers to the shortness of breath. So when this low VQ ratio, low ventilator to perfusion rate occurs, an individual will suffer from hypoxia, which refers to low oxygen in the blood, and dyspnea, where they will have a shortness of breath and struggle to breathe. Okay. That is everything that we're going to be covering in this pneumonia video. Hopefully this video helped you understand these processes in a little bit more detail and helped you understand the acquisition process of pneumonia. It definitely helped me solidify my knowledge in this recently learned topic. With all that being said, that's all we're going to be covering in this video.